A black woman was driving home on the highway when she suddenly hit the brakes. She had noticed a man standing on the side of the road waving his arms for help beside a broken-down car. Although she felt afraid, she got out of her vehicle to ask what was wrong. To her surprise, she saw a pregnant woman crying out in pain as strong contractions hit her. The hospital was too far away to reach in time, so she decided to take them back to her home and help deliver the baby herself. That brave and risky choice led to something none of them could have ever imagined. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thought. The rain came down sideways that night in rural Georgia. Not the kind of gentle rain that lulls you to sleep, but the angry, violent kind that makes you question every decision you've ever made about leaving the house. Ruth Eleanor Carter gripped the steering wheel of her old Buick, her knuckles going white against the cracked leather. Her reflection flickered briefly in the rain-streaked windshield, dark skin lined by 68 years of worry, strength, and prayer. The dashboard clock read just past 6. She should have been home by now, starting dinner, letting the evening news play in the background. But Ruth was 68 years old, a widow for the past 7 years, and she never missed Wednesday night prayer service. Not once in 43 years. Not when Thomas was sick. Not when the kids moved away one by one. Not even when the arthritis in her hands got so bad she could barely grip the steering wheel. Tonight she was paying for that stubbornness. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, slapping back and forth with a rhythm that matched the pounding in her chest. The radio had given up 20 minutes ago, nothing but static crackling through the speakers like the sky itself was trying to speak and failing. Ruth leaned forward, squinting through the blur of water and the storm-darkened sky. Highway 12 was usually quiet at this stretch, especially during heavy rain. In this weather it felt like the last road on earth. Her headlights caught something up ahead. A shape on the shoulder, a car, dark-colored, maybe blue or black, hard to tell in the rain. Hazard lights blinking weakly like a heartbeat fading out. She watched a pickup truck barrel past without slowing. Then a sedan. Then an SUV with its high beams on, illuminating the stranded vehicle for just a moment before disappearing into the night. 3 cars, 4, 5. All of them saw. None of them stopped. Ruth's foot hovered over the brake pedal. Don't do it, she told herself. You're too old for this. Too tired. Your back's been aching all day and your eyes aren't what they used to be. What could you possibly do to help anyone in weather like this? And then there was the other thing. The thing she tried not to think about. Remember what happened last time you tried to help a stranger? Her eyes drifted to the small photo frame tucked into the corner of her dashboard. She'd kept it there for 30 years, but for the last decade she'd kept it face down. Couldn't bear to look at it most days. A flash of memory hit her hard and sudden, like lightning striking too close. A hospital corridor, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Herself younger, maybe 40, standing outside a door that wouldn't open. Rain streaming down the windows behind her. A doctor's voice, clinical and detached. I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter. There's nothing more we can do. She'd tried to help someone that night too. A stranger on the side of the road, just like now. And it had cost her something she could never get back. That memory should have made her keep driving. It almost did. Her foot pressed slightly on the gas pedal. The Buick lurched forward, gaining speed. The stranded car grew smaller in her rearview mirror. But then she thought about the person in that car. Alone, scared. Watching car after car pass them by like they didn't exist. Like they didn't matter. She knew that feeling. God, did she know that feeling? 3 seconds. That's how long Ruth hesitated. 3 seconds between the person she'd become, hardened by loss and disappointment, and the person she used to be, the one who believed that kindness was always worth the risk. Her foot moved from the gas to the brake. The Buick slowed, stopped, reversed. Ruth pulled onto the shoulder behind the stranded vehicle, her hazard lights joining theirs in a synchronized rhythm of distress. She sat there for a moment, rain hammering the roof of her car like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry. Her body was exhausted. Every joint ached. Her eyes burned from straining to see through the darkness. But her conscience, that was wide awake. that was standing at attention, reminding her of every prayer she'd ever said about being a good person, about treating others the way she'd want to be treated. Lord, she muttered, reaching for her raincoat in the back seat. I sure hope you know what you're doing, because I certainly don't. She opened the door, and the storm swallowed her whole. The rain soaked through Ruth's coat in seconds. It found every gap, every seam, running down her neck and into her collar like icy fingers reaching for her spine. She could barely see 3 feet in front of her face as she made her way toward the stranded vehicle. Up close, she could see it was a newer model Toyota. Nice car. The kind young professionals drove. It sat at an odd angle, the front end dipped toward the drainage ditch like it had tried to escape the road and thought better of it. Ruth knocked on the driver's window, her knuckles stinging from the cold. A face appeared behind the glass. Young man, maybe early 30s, clean-cut features now disheveled, eyes wide with panic. Eyes wide with a mixture of panic and surprise. He rolled down the window just a crack, enough to speak but not enough to let the rain in. Ma'am, you shouldn't be out here in this. Neither should you, Ruth said, cutting him off. Her voice had that authoritative edge that came from decades of raising 4 children and teaching Sunday school. What's the trouble? Before he could answer, a sound came from the passenger seat that made Ruth's heart drop into her stomach. A woman's cry. Not just any cry. The kind that comes from deep in the gut, from a place beyond words. The kind Ruth had heard before, had made herself, many years ago in a room with white walls and machines that beeped and a life that was ending before it had barely begun. My wife, the young man said, his voice cracking like a boy half his age. She's pregnant. 8 months. The baby's coming early, way too early. The car just died. I don't know what happened. 1 minute it was fine, and then everything went dark, and the engine stopped, and there's no cell service out here. I've been trying for almost an hour, and I don't know what to do. He swallowed hard, dragging a hand through his wet hair. He swallowed hard, dragging a hand through his wet hair. We weren't supposed to be on the road tonight, he said. We had a flight booked. Mechanical issue, they grounded the plane this afternoon. He let out a short, humorless laugh. The weather report said the storm was still days out. 3 days, at least. He glanced at the windshield, at the rain coming down sideways like it had been waiting for them. Then the sky just changed its mind. Stop. Ruth held up her hand. Breathe, I need you to breathe. He nodded, swallowing hard, trying to compose himself. Open the back door. What? The back door. Open it. Now. He reached back and fumbled with the lock. Ruth yanked the door open and slid into the back seat, positioning herself next to the young woman. She was beautiful, even in distress. Early 30s like her husband, with dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat despite the cold. Her hands gripped her swollen belly like she was trying to hold the baby inside through sheer force of will. What's your name, sweetheart? Melissa. The word came out between gasps. It hurts. It's not supposed to hurt like this yet. It's too early. 3 weeks too early. Something's wrong, I know something's wrong. Look at me. Ruth took Melissa's face in her weathered hands, forcing their eyes to meet. Right here. Just me. Nothing else exists right now except you and me in this car. You understand? Melissa nodded weakly. Babies come when babies want to come. They don't check calendars, don't care about due dates. I've had 4 of my own and helped bring a few others into the world. 3 weeks early isn't the end of the world. It's not even close. But the hospital, we'll get you to the hospital. But first I need to know how far apart the contractions are. I don't know, maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. I can't think straight, everything hurts and I'm so scared. Being scared is normal. Being scared means you're paying attention. Ruth's voice was calm as a summer pond, steady as a heartbeat. How long have you been in labor? The pain started about 2 hours ago, but I thought they were just Braxton Hicks, you know, false labor, and then they got worse, and we were already on our way home from visiting James's mother, and another contraction hit, cutting off her words. Melissa grabbed Ruth's hand and squeezed so hard the older woman thought her bones might crack, but she didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just held on and waited for it to pass. The young husband turned around from the front seat, his face pale as milk in the darkness. The nearest hospital is at least 40 miles from here, maybe more. I've been trying to wave someone down for almost an hour. Car after car, after car. Nobody stops. He trailed off, shaking his head. They just keep going. Melissa's voice came out small and broken, barely above a whisper. They saw us. I watched their faces as they drove by. They looked right at us, and they kept driving. Ruth went completely still. Those words hit somewhere deep, in a place she kept locked and buried. A wound she'd convinced herself had scarred over. She knew exactly what it felt like to need help and watch the world drive past, to be visible but not seen, present but not acknowledged. Well, Ruth said, her voice rougher than she intended. I stopped, and that's what matters right now. She turned to the husband. What's your name, son? James. James Harper. James, can you get this car started at all? Even for a few minutes. He shook his head. I've tried everything. Engine's completely dead. I think it might be the alternator, but I'm not a mechanic. Neither am I. Doesn't matter. Ruth was already calculating options. 40 miles to the hospital, maybe 30 minutes in good conditions, which these definitely weren't. Flooded roads, zero visibility, no guarantee they'd even make it, and Melissa's contractions were coming faster. Here's what we're going to do. We're taking my car. It's old and ugly but it runs. James, I need you to help your wife. Carefully, one step at a time. We're going to get her into my back seat. But the hospital's so far. I know how far it is. I've lived in this county my entire life. I also know every back road, every shortcut, every alternative route. Ruth opened the door and stepped back into the rain. Now move. We're running out of time. The transfer was chaotic. Rain pounded them mercilessly as James half-carried his wife between vehicles. Melissa screamed twice when contractions hit mid-step. Ruth's old bones protested every movement, but she ignored them. Pain was temporary. Regret lasted forever. Finally, Melissa was settled in the back seat of the Buick, lying across the bench seat with her head on James's lap. Ruth cranked up the heat as high as it would go and pulled back onto the highway. What about our car? James asked, looking back at the abandoned Toyota. It'll be fine. Cars don't feel lonely. People do. Ruth caught his eyes in the rearview mirror. Right now, your wife and your baby are the only things that matter. Everything else can wait. She pressed the accelerator, and the old Buick surged forward into the darkness. For the first time in 7 years, Ruth felt like herself again. They made it exactly 7 miles before Ruth knew they weren't going to reach the hospital. The first sign was the water across the road. What was usually a small drainage creek had transformed into a rushing torrent that stretched across all 4 lanes, at least 2 feet deep and climbing. Ruth could see debris floating in it. Branches, garbage cans, what looked like part of someone's fence. She stopped the car, staring at the obstacle. Can we make it through? James asked, leaning forward between the seats. Not without drowning the engine. Ruth put the car in reverse. We'll go around. There's another route, but the other route was blocked too. A fallen tree, massive and ancient, lay across the road like a sleeping giant. No way around it. She tried a third road, a fourth. Each one had its own disaster, its own impossible obstacle. And all the while, Melissa's contractions were getting closer together. 4 minutes apart. 3.5. 3.5. 3. Ruth James's voice was barely controlled panic. What do we do? Ruth gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing through options like shuffling cards. The hospital was impossible. The roads were impossible, but impossible had never stopped her before. She thought about her house. 2 miles from here, give or take. Small but warm and dry. She had clean towels, running water, a backup generator if the power went out. It was insane. Reckless. Everything could go wrong. But sometimes the craziest option was the only option. We go to my house, Ruth said, already turning the car around. It's close, and I've got everything we need. Your house? James's voice rose an octave. You want to deliver my baby at your house? Are you insane? Are you a doctor? Do you have any medical training at all? I'm not a doctor, I'm a 68-year-old widow, who's buried a husband and raised 4 children and seen more of life's ugly surprises than you can imagine. Ruth met his eyes in the rearview mirror. But I've also delivered 3 babies in my lifetime. Not in hospitals, in rooms just like the ones in my house, with nothing but clean towels and hot water and the good Lord's guidance. 3 babies, 2 of them were my own grandchildren. My daughter went into labor during a Christmas snowstorm, couldn't get to the hospital. I delivered those twins on my living room floor. A ghost of a smile crossed Ruth's face. They're 12 years old now, healthy as horses, twice as stubborn. Melissa's voice cut through the tension, small but determined. James, I trust her. Melissa, I trust her. She stopped. Nobody else stopped, but she did. That means something. Another contraction hit, and Melissa's words dissolved into a moan of pain. When it passed, she grabbed her husband's hand. Take me to her house, please. James looked at his wife, looked at Ruth, looked out at the storm raging around them. Okay, he said finally. Okay, let's go. Ruth drove the remaining 2 miles with the focused intensity of a woman half her age. Every turn was precise, every decision was instinctive. She'd driven these roads for 50 years, she could navigate them blindfolded. Her house appeared through the rain like a beacon. Small white wooden siding that needed painting. A porch with a rocking chair that had belonged to her husband. Christmas lights she'd never taken down after Thomas died, because he'd been the one who always handled that. Getting Melissa inside was a struggle. The young woman could barely walk now, the contractions coming hard and fast. James supported most of her weight while Ruth cleared the path, unlocking doors and turning on lights. Spare bedroom, Ruth directed. End of the hall, used to be my youngest daughter's room before she moved to Atlanta. The room was small but clean. A double bed with a handmade quilt, a window that rattled in the wind, pictures on the wall of children who had grown up and moved away. They got Melissa onto the bed, just as another contraction hit. This one was different, longer, more intense, the kind that meant business. James, Ruth's voice was all authority now. I need you to listen carefully. Go to the kitchen, big pot on the stove, fill it with water and set it to boil. Then find every clean towel in the hall closet, all of them, and bring them here. After that, there's a first aid kit under the bathroom sink. Bring that too. He hesitated, clearly torn between following orders and staying with his wife. Go. Melissa gasped. I'm okay, she's got me. Go. He went. Ruth turned her full attention to Melissa. All right, Mama, let's see where we're at. The next hour was a blur of controlled chaos. Ruth moved through the motions like muscle memory, like her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. Checking dilation, coaching Melissa through the breathing, counting seconds between contractions, keeping her voice steady even when her own heart was racing. You're doing beautifully, keep breathing, just like that. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Good girl, perfect. At some point, a memory surfaced, sharp and uninvited. Like a splinter working its way out of skin. Herself, 32 years old, in labor with her youngest Michael, alone in this very house, because Thomas had died 2 months earlier in a car accident, and there was no one else to call. Her mother was gone. Her sisters lived 3 states away. Her older children were staying with neighbors. She had done it alone that night. Brought her son into the world with nothing but determination and terror, and a prayer that wouldn't stop running through her head. Please God, let him be okay. Please God, don't take him too. Michael was 36 now, lived in Chicago, called every Sunday without fail. He'd never known how close they'd both come to not making it. Now watching Melissa's face contort with another contraction, Ruth saw herself. The same fear, the same desperate strength, the same refusal to give up even when everything felt impossible. I can't, Melissa gasped, tears streaming down her face. I can't do this, it hurts too much. Ruth took her hand. Yes, you can. You're already doing it. Right now in this moment you are the strongest person in this room. You're the strongest person in this whole county. And this baby is coming whether you think you can handle it or not. But what if something goes wrong? What if the baby, then we'll handle it together. But I don't think anything is going wrong. I think your baby is just impatient, wants to meet her mama, can't wait another 3 weeks. Ruth squeezed her hand. That's a good sign. Strong babies don't wait. They make their own schedules. James burst back into the room, arms full of towels, eyes wild with fear, and something else, hope maybe, or the beginning of it. Is she okay? Is the baby? Your wife is doing beautifully. Now get over here and hold her hand. She needs you more than she needs me right now. He dropped the towels and practically dove to Melissa's side, taking her hand, kissing her forehead, murmuring words that Ruth couldn't hear but didn't need to. The moment came faster than any of them expected. I feel it, Melissa said suddenly, her voice completely changed, focused, certain. I feel the head. She's coming. Oh God, she's coming right now. Don't push yet, Ruth commanded. Wait for my signal. James, get behind her, support her back. Melissa, look at me, only at me. 1 contraction, rest. 2. Ruth's hands were positioned, ready. She'd done this before, she could do it again. Now, push now, everything you've got. Melissa screamed. James held her, Ruth guided, and then suddenly, there she was, a baby, small but loud, covered in the mess of birth but unmistakably, impossibly alive, crying with the indignant fury of someone who had been interrupted mid-sleep. Ruth cleared the airways, checked the fingers and toes, did everything she'd learned from decades of life and loss. All systems go, all parts accounted for. She cleaned the baby carefully with warm water from the pot James had boiled, wrapped her in the softest towel she could find, and placed her in Melissa's trembling arms. A girl, Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper. A healthy, beautiful, extremely loud little girl. Oh my God. Melissa was sobbing now, but the good kind of sobbing. The kind that came from joy too big to hold inside. Oh my God, she's here. She's actually here. Look at her, James. Look at what we made. James was crying too, his whole body shaking as he touched his daughter's face with fingers that trembled like leaves in the wind. She's perfect. She's absolutely perfect. Ruth stepped back, giving them their moment. Her job was done. The miracle had happened, as it always did, despite everything working against it. But something had shifted inside her during those frantic minutes. Watching Melissa hold her newborn, Ruth felt something loosen in her chest. A knot that had been there for years, decades even, began to unravel. This woman's fear had been Ruth's fear once. The same terror of facing motherhood alone. The same desperate hope that everything would somehow be okay. But tonight neither of them had been alone. Ruth looked down at her hands. They were shaking, covered in the evidence of new life. For the first time since Thomas died, she didn't feel tired. She felt alive. The storm broke sometime around 4 a.m. Ruth was dozing in the armchair by the window when she noticed the change. The rain had softened from a roar to a whisper. The wind had stopped rattling the shutters. By sunrise the sky was that particular shade of blue that only comes after really bad weather. Clean, pure, like the world had washed itself overnight, and was ready to start fresh. Ruth made coffee and eggs, her first real guests in longer than she could remember. Usually when people visited, it was out of obligation, checking on the old widow, making sure she hadn't fallen and broken a hip. This was different. Melissa was resting in the bedroom, the baby sleeping against her chest like she'd been there all along. The afterbirth had been handled, the bleeding had stopped, everything was exactly as it should be. A small miracle in the middle of a disaster. James sat at Ruth's kitchen table, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in one night, but somehow become younger at the same time. The panic was gone from his eyes. In its place was something Ruth recognized. Wonder, the particular wonder of new parenthood. I don't know how to thank you, he said, wrapping his hands around the coffee cup Ruth had placed in front of him. What you did last night, I don't have words for it. You don't need words, and you don't need to thank me. Ruth sat down across from him. I did what anyone would do. No. James shook his head firmly. That's not true, and you know it. We were on that road for almost an hour. Dozens of cars passed us. We could see them. They could see us. You were the only one who stopped. Ruth sipped her coffee, not meeting his eyes. Mrs. Carter, James said, and something in his voice made her look up. It was the voice of someone about to ask a question they weren't sure they had the right to ask. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer." "Why did you stop? In that weather at your age, no offense intended. Why take that risk for complete strangers?" Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Outside a bird started singing. The first sign of normal life returning. "Because a long time ago," she said finally, "I needed someone to stop for me, and nobody did." She had stood on that road before, a black woman in labor, waving in the rain, and watched headlights pass her like she was invisible. James waited. "I was younger then. Not much older than Melissa is now. My husband had just died, and I was pregnant with our fourth child, and everything was falling apart." Ruth's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something buried but not forgotten. "I went into labor alone, in a storm just like last night's. I managed to get myself to the road, flagged down cars for help. Nobody stopped, not a single soul. What happened? I delivered my son by myself, on the floor of this house, nearly bled to death afterward, but by some grace we both survived." She set down her coffee cup. "After that night, I made a promise to myself. I said I would never be the one who keeps driving, no matter how tired I was, no matter how scared, no matter what it cost me. And you've kept that promise all these years." "I've tried to." Ruth's eyes drifted to the window. "Haven't always succeeded, but I've tried." James nodded slowly, absorbing this. "That's that incredible story, Mrs. Carter. It's just life. Life isn't always incredible. Sometimes it's just hard, and you have to decide what kind of person you want to be in the hard moments." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. The coffee grew cold, the sun climbed higher. From the bedroom came the soft sounds of a baby waking up, those little mewling cries that Ruth remembered so well from her own children. An hour later, the roads were finally clear enough to travel. A tow truck came for the Harper-Sis car. After James managed to get cell service and make about a dozen calls, an ambulance arrived too, to take Melissa and the baby to the hospital for proper checkups. Before they left, James pulled Ruth aside on the porch. "I need your full name," he said, pulling out his phone. "Ruth Eleanor Carter, is that right?" "That's right. Why do you need all that? And this address?" 142 Maple Creek Road. Ruth gave him a long look. "Mr. Harper, what exactly are you planning?" "I just want to remember," James said simply, meeting her eyes. "I want to remember exactly who saved my family tonight. I want to be able to tell my daughter, when she's old enough, the name of the woman who brought her into the world." Ruth felt her cheeks warm slightly. "Well, that's very kind, but I didn't do anything special, just what needed to be done. That's exactly what makes it special." James extended his hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter, from the bottom of my heart." Ruth shook his hand, surprised by the firmness of his grip. "You take care of that little girl, and that wife of yours. They're both fighters. I will, I promise." She stood on her porch and watched them drive away. The ambulance first, carrying Melissa and the baby, then James in a rental car he'd somehow arranged. Melissa waved through the ambulance window, the baby bundled in her arms, and then they were gone. Ruth went back inside to clean up, changed the sheets in the spare bedroom, washed the towels, all 37 of them, put her life back in its usual order, one task at a time. She figured that was the end of the story. A strange night, a miracle birth, and now back to normal. Wednesday prayer service next week, Sunday dinner alone. The slow march of days that made up the life of a 68-year-old widow in rural Georgia. She was wrong. 3 weeks later, Ruth was in her garden pulling weeds when she heard a car pull up. Not just any car. The sound of the engine was different, smoother, more expensive, the kind of sound that didn't belong on Maple Creek Road. She straightened up, wiping dirt on her old jeans, squinting against the afternoon sun. A black Mercedes-Benz sat in her driveway, brand new from the look of it, the chrome gleaming like it had just rolled off a showroom floor. Ruth's first thought was that someone was lost. Her second thought was that someone was trying to sell her something. Her third thought, when she saw who stepped out of the driver's seat, made her forget the first two entirely. James Harper, different from the scared young man she'd met in the storm. This James wore a suit, that fit like it had been made specifically for his body, because it probably had. His hair was professionally styled. His shoes probably cost more than Ruth's monthly Social Security check. "Mrs. Carter," he said, walking toward her with a smile that seemed genuine despite everything about his appearance screaming money and power. "I hope I'm not intruding." Ruth pulled off her gardening gloves, taking her time. "Well, you're here, might as well tell me why. Would you mind if we talked inside? What I have to say might take a while." Ruth studied him for a moment. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Confidence, yes, but also something else. Nervousness, like a man about to ask a question he wasn't sure how to phrase. "I suppose I could use a break from these weeds anyway." She led him toward the house. "Sweet tea." "That would be wonderful. Thank you." Ruth made the tea the way she'd made it for 50 years, fresh brewed, just the right amount of sugar, served in glasses that had been wedding presents from people long dead. James sat in her living room looking around at the modest furniture, the family photographs, the knickknacks collected over a lifetime. "You have a beautiful home," he said. "I have an old home, there's a difference." Ruth handed him his glass and settled into her favorite armchair. "Now, what's so important that it brought you all the way back here in that fancy car?" James took a sip of tea, set the glass down carefully and looked Ruth straight in the eyes. "Mrs. Carter, I haven't been entirely honest with you about who I am. I figured that out when I saw your car. My name really is James Harper. That part was true, but there's more to the story." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "I'm the founder and CEO of Nexus Technologies. We're a software company based in San Francisco. Last year we were valued at about $12 billion. Ruth blinked, let the number settle. "Billion," she repeated. With a B. Well, Ruth leaned back in her chair. "That's certainly something. I grew up poor, Mrs. Carter, really poor. Food stamps and government cheese and apartments with roaches in the walls. My mother worked 3 jobs just to keep us fed, and there were still nights when dinner was crackers and water. I know what it's like to need help and not get it. I know what it's like to be looked through like you're invisible. So you made yourself impossible to ignore." Something like that. James smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I built my company from nothing. Worked every hour God gave me. Sacrificed relationships, health, everything because I never wanted to feel powerless again. And how's that working out for you?" "Honestly, I'm not sure anymore." He looked down at his hands. "Before the night of the storm, I thought success meant never having to depend on anyone. Being so rich that nothing could touch me or the people I loved. And now, I have a daughter, Grace Eleanor Harper. Healthy and beautiful and home safe because a 68-year-old woman in an old Buick decided to stop when no one else would." James met Ruth's eyes. "You changed how I see everything, Mrs. Carter. You showed me that all the money in the world doesn't matter if you're not willing to stop for the person who needs you." Ruth didn't know what to say to that, so she sipped her tea and waited. "I want to repay you," James said. "For what you did. Name your price. A new house, a new car. I could set up a trust fund for you, make sure you never have to worry about money for the rest of your life. I could fly your children and grandchildren out to visit whenever you want. Anything. Just tell me what you need." Ruth set down her glass, looked at this young man with his expensive suit and his billions of dollars and his desperate need to even a score that could never really be evened. Then she started laughing. Not a polite laugh, a real one, from somewhere deep in her belly. James stared at her confused. "Did I say something funny? Mr. Harper, I'm sorry." Ruth wiped her eyes. "I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing at the whole situation, I suppose." She caught her breath. "Here you are, one of the richest men in America, sitting in my living room offering me anything I want, and all I can think is how little any of that would change my life. I don't understand. I'm 68 years old. I've got a roof over my head that's paid off. I've got food in my fridge and a car that runs and a church family that checks on me every week. My children are grown and healthy. My grandchildren call me on birthdays." Ruth spread her hands. "What exactly would I do with $1 billion thank you? Buy a fancier coffin?" James opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "There must be something," he said finally. "Everyone wants something." "Maybe that's true, Ruth leaned forward. But here's what I've learned in 68 years of living. Money doesn't fix what's actually broken. It just makes it easier to pretend the problems aren't there. Throw enough cash at something and you can convince yourself you've solved it. But the brokenness is still there, underneath, and eventually it comes back up. Then what does fix it? People. Ruth's voice softened. People showing up for each other. Not because they're getting paid or because they're hoping for something in return, but because it's the right thing to do. Because we're all just struggling through this life together, and the only way any of us survive is by helping each other when we can. James was quiet for a long moment. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. "You're different from anyone I've ever met," he said finally. "I'm exactly like everyone you've never bothered to notice." Ruth's words were gentle, not harsh. "The world is full of people like me, Mr. Harper. Ordinary people doing ordinary kindnesses every single day. You just can't see them from the top of your tower." James absorbed this. Then he asked the question Ruth had been waiting for. "So what would you want me to do? If not for you then, for something, someone." Ruth looked at him, saw something real behind the expensive suit and the careful words. This was the moment, the turning point. She could send him away, back to his billions and his boardrooms and his life that had nothing to do with hers. Or she could try something else. "Come with me," she said, standing up. "There's something I want to show you." They drove through town in James's Mercedes. Ruth could feel people staring as they passed. A car like that didn't show up in these parts often. "Over there," Ruth pointed at a building on the corner of Main and Oak. "Used to be a free clinic. Open 3 days a week. Served about 200 families. Low income, no insurance. People who fell through the cracks." James slowed the car. The building was dark, windows covered with old newspapers. A for lease sign hung crooked on the door. "What happened?" "Closed down 4 years ago. Funding dried up. The doctor who ran it retired. Couldn't find anyone willing to take over for what the grant money was paying." Ruth's voice was matter of fact, but there was something underneath. "Woman died last year because she couldn't afford to get a lump checked out. By the time she finally made it to the emergency room in Macon, the cancer had spread everywhere." James said nothing, just stared at the empty building. "Keep driving, turn left at the light." They pulled up in front of another building. Larger, brick, with a worn sign that said Riverside Senior Center. "This place closed 2 years ago. Budget cuts. Nearest senior center now is 45 minutes away. You know how hard it is for elderly people without cars to get 45 minutes away. I can imagine." "No, Mr. Harper, you can't, because you've never had to." Ruth's voice wasn't accusatory, just honest. "The old folks in this town used to come here every day, play cards, have a hot lunch, see their friends. Some of them, it was the only human contact they had. When this place closed, 3 people died within the year. Not from illness, from loneliness, from giving up." They drove on, past the elementary school where Ruth had volunteered for 20 years, past the church where she'd been baptized and married and had sung at her husband's funeral, past all the landmarks of a small American town that was slowly, quietly falling apart. Every Friday during the school year, Ruth said, teachers pack backpacks full of food for about 40 kids. Kids whose families can't afford to feed them on weekends when there's no school lunch. 40 kids in a town of 3,000 people, going hungry in the richest country on earth. She directed him back to her house. They sat in the driveway, engine idling. "That's what's broken around here, Mr. Harper. Not my house or my car or my bank account. People who need help and don't have anywhere to turn. Systems that are supposed to catch them that have holes bigger than the net." James was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, stripped of the polish and the careful corporate smoothness. "When I was 6 years old," James said, "my mother worked 2 jobs, one at a diner, one at the grocery store. We had insurance sometimes. Sometimes we didn't. When she got sick, we were between jobs, between coverage. The hospital paperwork mattered more than the pain." Ruth turned to look at him. "She died," James continued, his jaw tight, "in our apartment, in my arms, not because no one knew how to save her, but because the system decided we didn't qualify in time. He finally met Ruth's eyes. I built my whole company trying to outrun that memory, trying to get so rich and so powerful that nothing like that could ever touch me or anyone I loved again. And has it worked? I thought it had, until the night of the storm. Until I sat on the side of the road with my wife in labor and watched the whole world drive past us like we didn't exist. James's voice cracked. In that moment, all my money and power meant nothing. I was that scared 6-year-old boy again, watching his mother die because nobody cared enough to help. Ruth reached over and placed her hand on his. A simple gesture, human contact. "You're not that boy anymore," she said, "and your mother would be proud of who you've become." Would she? I'm not sure I'm proud of who I've become. Then change. That's the beautiful thing about being alive, Mr. Harper. Every day is a chance to become someone different, someone better. They sat in silence for a moment. The afternoon light was starting to fade. "What if I could help?" James said finally. "Not just write a check and disappear. Really help, build something that lasts." Like what? A community center. Something that could house the clinic and the senior center and a food bank. Everything you showed me under one roof. Properly funded, properly staffed, designed to actually serve the people who need it. Ruth studied him carefully. "That's a big promise." "I've got big resources." He paused. "But I'd need you to guide me. Tell me what this town actually needs, not what I think it needs from my office in San Francisco. I don't want to be another rich guy who swoops in with solutions nobody asked for." Ruth considered this. Part of her wanted to say no, stay out of it, keep her life simple and small and safe. But another part of her, the part that had pulled over in the rain that night, couldn't turn away from the possibility. "All right," she said finally. "Let's talk, but not here. Come to church with me on Sunday. Meet the people you'd be helping. Listen to them, not just to me." James nodded. "I can do that. And Mr. Harper, one more thing. Yes, leave the Mercedes at home." For the first time since he'd arrived, James genuinely smiled. 3 months later, the Riverside Community Center project was officially announced. James had done everything Ruth asked. He'd come to church, introduced himself without mentioning his net worth, spent hours talking to elderly residents and young families and everyone in between. He'd set up a charitable trust with an initial donation of $5 million. He'd hired architects who specialized in community-focused design, consulted with town leaders, done everything by the book and then some. The local newspaper ran a front-page story. Ruth's picture was in it, standing next to James at the groundbreaking ceremony. She'd hated every second of that photo shoot, but James had insisted. "People need to see that this is about them, not me. You're their representative." For about 2 weeks, everything seemed perfect. The town buzzed with excitement. People who hadn't spoken to each other in years came together to share ideas for the new center. It felt like a community again, not just a collection of people who happened to live near each other. Then the problem started. It began with the property taxes. The announcement of a major development project triggered the county to reassess property values in the area. "Standard procedure," they said. "Just making sure the rolls are accurate." The result was anything but standard. Ruth's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, showed up on her porch one evening with a piece of paper clutched in her hands like it was a death warrant. "Look at this, Ruth." She thrust the paper forward. "Just look." It was a tax bill. The number at the bottom was 40% higher than the previous year. "I'm on a fixed income," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice shaking. "I've got Social Security and a tiny pension from my husband's job at the factory. That's it. How am I supposed to come up with an extra $2,000 a year? There must be some mistake. Let me call someone." I already called. Spent 3 hours on hold with the county assessor. They said the property values in our area have increased due to anticipated development. They said it's perfectly legal. Mrs. Patterson's eyes were wet. "I've lived in that house for 52 years, Ruth. My husband built it with his own 2 hands. His grandfather owned the land before him. And now I might lose it because of your project." The word hit Ruth like a fist to the stomach. "Your project. I didn't know this would happen," Ruth said. "I never meant." "I know you didn't mean it. That's what makes it worse. Mrs. Patterson turned and walked away, her shoulders slumped like she was carrying the weight of the world. Ruth stood on her porch watching her go, feeling something cold settle in her chest. It got worse from there. Rumors started spreading through town like brush fire. Someone was buying up properties around the proposed community center site. Small lots, old houses, land that had been in families for generations. Quiet transactions, cash deals, the kind that happened fast and left questions behind. Ruth started noticing things. People going quiet when she walked into the grocery store. Conversations that stopped mid-sentence at church. Eyes that slid away from hers instead of meeting them. Some people said she was overstepping. Others said she should have known her place. No one said what that place was. One afternoon she overheard two women talking in the pharmacy aisle, not realizing she was one row over. "My cousin had an offer on her place last week, $50,000 over market value. Can you believe it? Who's buying? Some development company. Never heard of them before, but the papers list them as being from Atlanta. You think it's connected to that community center thing? Has to be, doesn't it? Nothing happens in this town for 40 years, and suddenly there's money flying everywhere. I heard Ruth Carter is behind the whole thing. Her and that billionaire from California." Ruth left the pharmacy without buying what she'd come for. Then she met the man everyone was talking about. His name was Gerald Mason, third-generation Georgian. His grandfather had built the first general store in town. His father had served on the county board for 20 years. Gerald himself had coached Little League for a decade before his business took off. He showed up at Ruth's door on a Sunday afternoon, right after she got home from church. A Cadillac SUV sat in her driveway, but it was the older model, not the flashiest one. The kind of car a successful man drives when he doesn't need to prove anything. "Mrs. Carter," he said, extending his hand with a warm smile. "I've been wanting to meet you. I'm Gerald Mason. I believe you knew my mother Dorothy. She used to sit 2 pews behind you at First Baptist before she passed." Ruth hesitated, then shook his hand. "I remember Dorothy. She made the best peach cobbler at the church potlucks. She did. I've never been able to replicate it, no matter how hard I try." Gerald's laugh was easy, genuine sounding. "Would you mind if we talked for a few minutes? I promise I won't take up too much of your afternoon." Something about his manner made Ruth pause. This wasn't what she'd expected from the man people had been whispering about. "I suppose you can come in. I just made sweet tea." They sat in her living room. Gerald admired the family photos on the wall, asked about her grandchildren, mentioned that his daughter had been in the same graduating class as Ruth's youngest. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Carter," he said finally, setting down his tea glass. "I'm worried about this town. I've watched it struggle for years. Businesses closing, young people leaving, families barely getting by." He shook his head. "It breaks my heart. This is my home. My roots go back 4 generations here. Mine too," Ruth said carefully. "That's why I wanted to help. I know, and I respect that. I truly do." Gerald leaned forward, his expression earnest. "But here's what concerns me. I've been in development for 30 years. I've seen a lot of well-intentioned projects come into small towns like ours. Outside money, big promises, beautiful plans, and most of them fail. Not because the people behind them are bad, but because they don't understand the rhythms of a place like this. They build something that looks good on paper, but it doesn't fit. Then the money dries up, the outsiders go home, and we're left with an empty building and broken promises." Ruth felt her defenses rising, but she couldn't deny there was logic in what he was saying. "Mr. Harper isn't like that. He genuinely wants to help. I believe you. I'm not questioning his motives." Gerald's voice was patient, almost gentle. "But Mrs. Carter, he's a billionaire from San Francisco. His life is private jets and board meetings. How long do you think this town will hold his attention? A year? 2? What happens when the next crisis or opportunity pulls him away?" Ruth didn't have an answer for that. "I've seen the property values shifting already," Gerald continued. "Families who've been here for generations are suddenly looking at tax bills they can't afford. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because that's what happens when big money enters a small market. That wasn't supposed to happen. I know it wasn't. But it did. Gerald spread his hands. I'm not here to attack you or your project. I'm here because I think I might be able to help. Help how? I have relationships with the county board, the planning commission, the mayor's office. Not because I bought them, but because I've worked with them for 30 years. I know how to navigate the system, how to protect long-time residents from being priced out. He paused. What if we work together? Your vision for a community center combined with my experience in making developments actually work for the people who live here. Ruth studied him. There was no smugness in his face, no hidden agenda she could detect, just a man who seemed genuinely concerned about his hometown. What would that look like? A phased approach. Start smaller, prove the concept, build community buy-in before we break ground on anything major. Maybe add some commercial elements that can generate revenue to sustain the non-profit services long-term. Gerald smiled. A community center with a small grocery store attached, for instance. The store profits fund the free clinic. That's sustainability. That's how you build something that lasts beyond any one donor's attention span. It made sense. Ruth hated how much sense it made. I'll think about it, she said finally. Talk to James. That's all I ask. Gerald stood extending his hand again. Mrs. Carter, I know people have been saying things about me, that I'm trying to steal this project or push you out, but I hope you'll judge me by my actions, not by rumors. Ruth shook his hand. I always do, Mr. Mason. He left his business card on her coffee table. After he drove away, Ruth sat for a long time, turning it over in her fingers. She wanted to believe him. He'd known her husband. His mother had sat 2 pews behind her for 30 years. Maybe this was the answer. Maybe Gerald Mason was exactly what this project needed. Someone who understood the system, who had the connections to make things work, who could protect the community from the unintended consequences Ruth hadn't foreseen. She picked up the phone to call James. She didn't notice the way Gerald had positioned himself throughout the conversation, how every word had been carefully chosen, how he'd mentioned his mother and her cobbler, and his daughter's graduation class, all within the first 2 minutes. She didn't know that he'd spent an hour researching her family before driving over. She didn't know that his phased approach would phase out everything except the commercial development. She didn't know that the man who just sat in her living room and spoken so eloquently about protecting long-time residents had already purchased, through a shell company, 17 properties surrounding the proposed community center site. Ruth Carter had survived 68 years by trusting her instincts about people. For the first time in a long time, her instincts were wrong. Sometimes the best thing a person can do is accept their limitations and let others handle things beyond their understanding. He got in his Cadillac and drove away. Ruth stood on her porch for a long time after he left. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that she'd normally find beautiful. But all she could think about was Mrs. Patterson's face, the whispers in the pharmacy, the way people looked at her now, like she was the cause of their problems instead of someone trying to help. Maybe she thought for the first time since that stormy night, I should have kept driving. The town hall meeting was standing room only. Ruth arrived early, taking a seat in the back row where she could see everyone but not be the center of attention. It didn't work. People noticed her the moment she walked in. Heads turned, whispers spread. The council chamber smelled like old wood and anxiety. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. American flag in the corner, crooked on its pole. Faces Ruth had known for decades, some of them for her entire life, looked at her differently now, not with hostility exactly. Something worse, disappointment, betrayal. Mayor Dawkins called the meeting to order. Small town official, trying to manage big town problems. You could see the stress in the lines around his eyes. We're here to discuss the ongoing concerns regarding the Riverside Community Center project and related development in our area. I'll open the floor for public comment, and I ask that everyone remain civil and respectful. The first speaker was a man Ruth didn't recognize, young, maybe 30, in a suit that didn't quite fit. He talked about investment opportunities and responsible growth, and a lot of other phrases that sounded like they came from a press release.
The second speaker was a woman who'd been 2 years behind Ruth in high school. She talked about property taxes and how she'd already had to take money from her retirement fund to pay the increase. The third speaker made Ruth's stomach drop. Henry Wallace. They'd sung in the church choir together for 15 years. He'd been a pallbearer at Thomas's funeral. His wife sent Ruth a casserole every Christmas because she worried about her being alone. Henry walked to the microphone with the slow deliberation of a man about to say something he'd rehearsed in his head 100 times. "I've known Ruth Carter for most of my life," he began. "She's a good woman, a kind woman. She's helped more people in this town than anyone could count." Ruth felt a small flutter of hope, but that's exactly why this is so hard. The flutter died.
"My son Michael has been saving for 5 years to buy his first house. 5 years of working double shifts, living in a cramped apartment, putting away every penny he could. He finally found a place 3 blocks from where they want to build this center. Made an offer last month." Henry's voice cracked. He paused, composed himself, continued. "The seller came back yesterday. Said there was another offer, $60,000 above asking price. Cash. Michael can't compete with that. The house is gone." Murmurs rippled through the room. "I'm not saying Ruth meant for this to happen. I'm not saying her intentions weren't good, but intentions don't pay mortgages. Intentions don't give my son back the 5 years he spent saving for a dream that just got snatched away." He turned to look at Ruth directly. Their eyes met across the crowded room. "I just want to ask Mrs. Carter one thing. Do you understand what you've done to this town?" The room went silent. Everyone was looking at her now. Ruth rose slowly. Her knees ached. Her heart ached more. "I understand more than you know, Henry." Her voice was steady, but it took effort. "I've spent the last 3 weeks talking to people just like you. Hearing stories just like yours. Every one of them breaks my heart. Then why don't you stop it? Why don't you call off the whole thing? It's not that simple. It is that simple." Henry's voice rose. "You brought this here. You invited that billionaire in. You started all of this, and now the rest of us are paying the price while you stand there telling us it's complicated." "Henry, my mother is 83 years old. She's lived in her house for 60 years. She got a letter from the county last week saying her property tax assessment doubled. She's going to lose her home, Ruth, because of your project, your good intentions." He sat down heavily, like the speech had drained everything out of him. More speakers followed, more stories, more anger and fear and confusion. Gerald Mason sat in the front row throughout the meeting, not saying a word. He didn't have to. The community was doing his work for him. When the public comment period ended, the council took a vote. The Riverside Community Center project would be paused pending a full environmental and economic impact study. Everyone knew what that meant. Death by bureaucracy. Then came the second vote. Gerald's commercial development proposal, which had been sitting in committee for 2 years gathering dust, was fast-tracked for approval. Same site, same land, different purpose. Ruth sat in her seat as the meeting adjourned, watching people file out around her. Some avoided her eyes. Others gave her looks that made her feel like she'd committed a crime. Mrs. Patterson stopped beside her chair. The neighbor she'd known for 40 years. "I hope you're happy," she said quietly. "We were fine before you got involved. Stable. Now everything's a mess. And that developer is going to win anyway, and we're all worse off than we started." She shook her head. "We didn't ask for your help, Ruth. We never asked." She walked away. Ruth sat in the empty council chamber until the janitor came to turn off the lights. That night, for the first time in decades, Ruth questioned everything she believed about kindness, about helping, about what it meant to do the right thing. Maybe the right thing was impossible. Maybe every choice led somewhere wrong. Maybe the best anyone could hope for was to cause the least harm. She turned the photo on her mantel face down again. Some wounds never healed. They just waited for the right moment to open back up. James flew in from San Francisco the day after Ruth called him. She told him everything. The meeting, the votes, Gerald Mason, all of it. They sat in her living room, both looking older than they had 3 months ago. Ruth noticed new gray in James's hair, new lines around his eyes. The price of responsibility. "My team investigated Gerald Mason," James said, setting down a folder full of documents on the coffee table between them. "It took some digging, but we found connections that explain a lot. Tell me," He's the primary campaign donor for 4 of the 5 county board members, has been for the last decade. He also has a controlling interest in the company that's been buying up properties around the center site. Ruth felt sick, so the land purchases started the day after we announced the project. He knew what was coming before anyone else did. Bought cheap in the window before prices spiked, planning to sell high or develop on his own terms. The tax increases, the property values, the fear, most of it was manufactured, or at least deliberately stoked. He's been feeding rumors through proxies for months, turning people against the project, against you, so he could position himself as the reasonable alternative. Ruth closed her eyes. We played right into his hands. We were trying to do something good. He was trying to make money. Those aren't the same game. And now he's won. The center is dead, his development is approved, and I'm the villain in a story where I was trying to be the hero. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Ruth didn't expect. I've been thinking about this all week. Flying out here, I had a lot of time to think. He leaned forward, hands clasped. I think I need to withdraw. Completely. What do you mean? Pull the funding, shut down the trust, issue a public apology and walk away, let the whole thing die. Ruth stared at him. After everything we've been through, everything we've worked for, because of everything we've worked for. Look around, Ruth. The people you wanted to help are hurting because of our involvement. Mason is using my presence as a weapon against them. Outside billionaire trying to change your town. Every day I stay involved gives him more ammunition. So you're giving up. I'm accepting reality. James met her eyes and she saw the same exhaustion she felt reflected back at her. Sometimes the best thing you can do is recognize when your help is making things worse. I came here with good intentions. But good intentions aren't enough if the result is harm. What about the clinic, the senior center, the kids who need food on weekends? I don't know. Maybe someone local can carry it forward eventually, without my name attached. Maybe the community needs time to find its own way without outside interference. He paused. All I know is that staying is making things worse, not better. Ruth sat with that for a long moment. She thought about the hospital door closing 30 years ago. The way she'd stood alone in the rain, waiting for help that never came. The promise she'd made to herself afterward, never be the one who keeps driving. But what if stopping had been the wrong choice all along? What if her one act of kindness had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately cause more harm than good? You know what the worst part is, Ruth said finally. I'm not sure you're wrong. James didn't respond. There was nothing to say. They sat in silence as the afternoon light faded. Two people who had tried to do something good and watched it crumble in their hands. Ruth spent 3 days alone in her house, barely eating, barely sleeping. She sat in Thomas's old chair and stared at the wall, replaying every decision she'd made since the night of the storm. Every moment where she could have chosen differently. Every road not taken. She thought about Mrs. Patterson losing her home. About Henry Wallace's son and his shattered dream. About the elderly people who would go without healthcare because the clinic would never be built. She thought about Gerald Mason collecting his properties and his profits while good people suffered for his greed. And she thought about herself, a 68-year-old widow who had tried to make a difference and ended up making everything worse. On the 4th day she woke up before dawn with a strange clarity in her mind. She knew what she had to do. She called James at 5 a.m. California time. I need you to set up one more town meeting, she said when he answered. Ruth, I told you, I'm withdrawing. I know what you told me, and I'm not asking you to change that. I'm asking you to give me a chance to speak. One more time. After that you can do whatever you think is right. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. What are you planning? Something I should have done from the beginning. The meeting happened 5 days later. Same council chamber, same fluorescent lights, same American flag in the corner. But the atmosphere was different this time. Curious, expectant. Gerald Mason sat in the front row, his Cadillac parked prominently outside. He dressed up for the occasion, like a man arriving to accept an award. Ruth walked to the microphone with her head held high. She didn't have notes, didn't need them. Most of you expected me to come here tonight to fight, she began. To argue that we should push forward with the community center despite everything that's happened. To make speeches about not giving up and standing strong. The room was silent. Even the usual coughing and shuffling had stopped. But I'm not here to fight. I'm here to do something I should have done weeks ago. Ruth took a deep breath. I'm asking the council to permanently cancel the Riverside Community Center project. Gasps, murmurs. Gerald Mason's eyebrows shot up before he managed to compose his face back into its usual smug mask. I made a mistake, Ruth continued, her voice steady. Not in wanting to help, I'll never apologize for that, but in how I went about it. I brought in outside money and outside plans without really listening to what this community needed. I let my own hopes, my own vision of what would be good for you, overshadow your voices. And when things started going wrong, I kept pushing instead of stepping back. She turned to look at Gerald Mason directly. He met her gaze with what he probably thought was an expression of dignified restraint. It looked more like a snake watching a mouse. But I want to be very clear about something, Ruth said, still looking at him. I'm not canceling this project because the opposition won. I'm not bowing to pressure or giving up because things got hard. Her voice hardened. I'm canceling it because a community center built on fear and division isn't a community center at all. It's a monument to good intentions gone wrong. And if this building can only exist by driving long-time residents from their homes, by turning neighbors against each other, by becoming a political weapon for people who care more about profit than community, she paused, letting her eyes sweep the room, meeting as many gazes as she could. Then it shouldn't exist. Not like this, not at this cost. She stepped back from the microphone. That's all I have to say. For a long moment nothing happened. The room held its breath. Then Henry Wallace stood up, the same man who had publicly blamed her at the last meeting, who had spoken about his son's lost dream and his mother's threatened home, who had looked at her like she was the enemy. He stood up, and he started to clap, slow at first, deliberate, not applause for a performance but acknowledgement of something genuine. One by one, others joined him. Mrs. Patterson, tears on her cheeks, the young woman from the pharmacy, people Ruth had known for decades, people who had turned away from her now turning back. Gerald Mason sat in his front row seat, his smile frozen in place, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. Wait a minute, someone called out. A man Ruth didn't recognize, maybe mid-40s, wearing a factory uniform. If we cancel the community center, doesn't Mason's development go through instead? Isn't that worse? Good question, another voice chimed in. Who's been buying up all those properties anyway? My neighbor sold last month, said the buyer was some company out of Atlanta. I heard Mason's involved in that company. Is that true? The county board members who approved his project, who's funding their campaigns? The room erupted into questions, not questions directed at Ruth anymore. Questions directed at the man in the front row, whose carefully constructed facade was cracking by the second. Gerald stood up, his face reddening. Now hold on, I'm a businessman, yes. But everything I've done has been completely legal and above board. Legal isn't the same as right, someone shouted. You've been playing us against each other this whole time, haven't you? My mother's tax bill doubled because of you, not because of Ruth. The mayor banged his gavel trying to restore order. But something had shifted in the room. The fear that had been directed at the wrong target was redirecting itself. People were asking the questions they should have asked months ago. Gerald grabbed his jacket and headed for the exit, muttering about mob mentality and consulting with his lawyers. No one tried to stop him, but no one looked at him with respect anymore either. Ruth slipped out the back door before anyone could corner her. She'd said what she needed to say. The rest was up to them. She walked home in the dark, her feet following the familiar path without conscious thought. The stars were out, clear and cold and endless. For the first time in months, Ruth felt something like peace. Not victory, not defeat, just clarity. She had done the right thing. Maybe it wouldn't fix everything. Maybe Gerald would find another way to get what he wanted. Maybe the community center would never be built and all those people who needed help would keep struggling. But she had told the truth. She had put the community ahead of her pride. She had shown people what real kindness looked like. Not grand gestures and $5 million donations, but the humble willingness to admit when you're wrong. That was worth something. It had to be. 6 months passed. The commercial development never got approved. Too many questions had been raised about conflicts of interest, about land purchases that didn't add up, about campaign donations that looked a lot like bribes when you examined them closely.
Gerald Mason quietly moved his business interest to another county. Last Ruth heard, he was facing an ethics investigation that might take years to resolve. The community center as originally conceived was never built either, but something else happened, something Ruth hadn't planned or expected or dared to hope for. It started small, a group of younger residents, inspired by what Ruth had tried to do and chastened by how quickly they turned against her, started meeting in the church basement every Thursday night. Not to plan grand projects or raise millions of dollars, just to talk, to listen, to ask each other what they actually needed. From those conversations grew something organic, homegrown, imperfect but real. They convinced the county to let them use the old senior center building 3 days a week for free, since it was just sitting empty anyway. A retired doctor from 2 towns over volunteered to hold clinic hours twice a month. A church group started a food pantry in their fellowship hall. It wasn't big, wasn't impressive, wouldn't make headlines or attract billionaire donors, but it was theirs. Ruth helped where she could. Not as a leader this time, just as another member of the community. She drove people to appointments when they needed rides, dropped off groceries for neighbors who were homebound, sat with elderly folks on lonely afternoons, playing cards and sharing stories. She didn't try to fix everything anymore, just did what she could, where she could, when she could. One spring morning, about a year after the night of the storm, a package arrived at Ruth's door. It was small, padded envelope, overnight delivery from San Francisco. Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a handmade card, construction paper glitter glue, the kind of thing only a child could make. On the front was a drawing, a house with a yellow sun, a woman with gray hair holding a small figure with brown hair. Ruth opened the card. Happy first birthday, Grace Eleanor Harper, named for the woman who stopped when no one else would. Thank you for showing our family what kindness really means. We hope to visit this summer. Grace is already trying to walk. Love always, James, Melissa and Grace. Ruth sat down heavily in her kitchen chair, the card pressed against her chest. Grace Eleanor. They'd given that baby her middle name. This child she'd brought into the world on a stormy night in her spare bedroom would carry a piece of her forever. She stayed there for a long time, tears running down her face. Not sad tears, not even entirely happy tears, just tears for all of it, everything she'd gained and lost and learned in the past year. James had kept his word about stepping back from the community center project. But before he left, he'd done one thing quietly, without fanfare or publicity. He'd set up a small anonymous fund that paid the property tax increases for 4 elderly residents who had been at risk of losing their homes. Mrs. Patterson was one of them. She never knew where the money came from. Ruth never told her. That afternoon, Ruth was sitting on her porch rereading the birthday card for probably the 20th time, when she heard tires screech in the distance. She looked up. A car had stopped on the side of the main road, maybe a quarter-mile away. She could see the hazard lights blinking, and then something happened that made her heart swell until she thought it might burst. One car pulled over behind it, then another, then a third. People got out, walked toward the stranded vehicle, checked on the driver, offered help. Ruth watched from her rocking chair, tears forming in her eyes again. She hadn't started a movement, hadn't changed the world, hadn't built a community center or reformed the healthcare system or solved poverty in rural Georgia. She just stopped on a rainy night when everyone else kept driving. And somehow, impossibly, that had been enough. The small volunteer center held its official opening a few weeks later. Nothing fancy, just a ribbon cutting with scissors borrowed from the elementary school and lemonade someone's grandmother had made. The building wasn't new, it was the old senior center, cleaned up and repurposed, carrying all the memories of what it had been before. They'd decided not to name it after anyone. Not Ruth, not James, not any of the donors or volunteers who had made it possible. But someone Ruth never found out who had hung a small wooden sign by the entrance. It said simply, for those who stop. Ruth stood at the back of the small crowd during the ceremony, trying not to be noticed. But Mrs. Patterson found her anyway. You know, the older woman said, coming to stand beside Ruth, I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything, Patricia. Yes, I do. I was scared. We all were. And instead of thinking things through, we let that fear turn us against the one person who was actually trying to help. Mrs. Patterson's voice was thick with emotion. You gave up everything you'd worked for, not because you had to, but because you cared more about us than about being right. Ruth shook her head. I wasn't trying to be right, I was just trying not to make things worse. That's the same thing sometimes. They watched the ribbon cutting together. The mayor made a short speech about community and cooperation. Children ran around the parking lot, too young to understand the complicated history of the ground they were playing on. Someone had brought a portable speaker playing gospel music. It wasn't the ending Ruth had imagined when she'd pulled over on that stormy night. It was smaller, messier, more complicated, but maybe that was okay. Maybe kindness wasn't about grand gestures and perfect outcomes. Maybe it was about showing up, making mistakes, learning from them, and trying again. Maybe it was about being humble enough to admit when you were wrong and brave enough to keep going anyway. That evening, Ruth sat alone in her living room as the sun set. She reached for the photo frame on her mantel, the one she'd kept face down for so many years. Slowly, carefully, she turned it over. A young woman looked back at her. Dark hair, bright eyes, a smile that had survived so much loss. Holding a newborn baby in a hospital bed, a tired but happy man beside her. Her family, her past, her wound that had finally begun to heal. Ruth placed the photo upright on the mantel, where she could see it every day. We did okay, Thomas, she whispered to the man in the picture. We made some mistakes along the way, but we did okay. Outside, the last light of day painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere down the road, a car horn honked twice, friendly, not impatient. Someone calling out to a neighbor. Ruth closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of her small town settling into evening. Crickets starting up, dogs barking in the distance, children being called in for dinner. These were the sounds of a community, imperfect, struggling, sometimes petty and fearful, but also capable of kindness when it mattered most. She had been part of that community for 68 years, and God willing, she'd be part of it for a few more. The final word: here's what I want you to understand about Ruth's story. She didn't set out to be a hero. She was a tired 68-year-old woman driving home from church in a storm. Her back hurt, her eyes were tired. She'd made a promise to herself years ago about helping strangers, but promises are easy to break when you're cold and wet and just want to go home. She could have kept driving. Most people would have. Most people did, but she stopped. And that one choice, that 3-second decision on a rainy highway, set off a chain of events that changed an entire community. Not in the way she planned, not without pain and setback and doubt, and moments when she wished she'd never gotten involved, but changed nonetheless. Because here's the truth about kindness that nobody tells you. It's not always rewarded. It's not always recognized. Sometimes it costs you more than you ever expected to pay. Sometimes it makes things worse before it makes them better. Sometimes people will hate you for trying to help, and sometimes they'll be right to. But kindness that comes from the right place, kindness that's willing to be humble, to admit mistakes, to put people ahead of pride, that kind of kindness never disappears. It just keeps moving, from person to person, heart to heart, storm to storm. Ruth didn't save the world. She didn't solve poverty or fix healthcare or defeat corruption. She just showed up, again and again in the ways she could, for the people she could reach. And in the end, that was enough to remind a whole community of something they'd forgotten, that they could show up for each other too. So the next time you see someone stranded on the side of the road, literal or otherwise, remember Ruth. Remember the 3 seconds she hesitated. Remember that she stopped anyway, and ask yourself, which kind of person do you want to be? The one who keeps driving, eyes fixed straight ahead, telling yourself it's not your problem, and someone else will handle it, or the one who stops? The choice is yours. It's always been yours. And it matters more than you know. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment below telling me about a time someone stopped for you, or a time you stopped for someone else, because these stories matter. Every single one of them, and so do you. Until next time.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.